Hi all, welcome to Physio Exam Buddy. This video is on the intercellular communications. Please don't confuse between intercellular connections and communications. Intercellular communications means the communications happening between the cells. That is, the cells mainly communicate with one another via the chemical messengers. So this chemical messengers is the one which helps in the communication between the cells in a tissue. And in a tissue, either the messengers can move via the gap junctions without entering into the extracellular fluid, or the cells can also be affected by the chemical messengers secreted into the extracellular fluid. And once these messengers bind to the receptors, these receptors which is present on the cell can be either on the surface of the cell or on the cytoplasm of the cell or on the nucleus of the cell. So once these chemical messengers bind to the receptors which is present either on the surface of the cell or in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus of the cell, this binding will trigger a sequences of intracellular changes, and these intracellular changes is responsible for the production of the physiological effects. And there are different types by which the cells communicate between one another. That is, these are the 5 types of intercellular communications. First one is the neural communication. Second is the endocrine type of communication. Third is the paracrine type of communication. Fourth is the autocrine type of communication. And the fifth is the juxtacrine type of communication. And we will be seeing in detail about the different types of these intercellular communications. First is about the neural communication, and the classical example for neural communication is the synapse. And you know that there is a presynaptic neuron as well as a postsynaptic neuron, and in between there is a synaptic cleft, and the neurotransmitters are released from this presynaptic membrane into the synaptic junctions, and they act across the synaptic cleft on the postsynaptic cell. This type of communication, it is known as the neural communication. Second one is the endocrine communication. That is, the main medium through which the endocrine glands communicate is by the circulating blood. That is, the endocrine glands will secrete the specific type of hormones into the circulating blood, and the blood will carry these hormones as well as the growth factors into their target organs. That type of communication, it is known as the endocrine communication. Next type is the paracrine communication. That is, the product of the cells will diffuse first into the extracellular fluid, and from the extracellular fluid they will diffuse to the neighboring cells and makes their action in the neighboring cell. That type of communication, it is known as the paracrine communication. So you can see here in this diagram, this cell produces a product that is P, which will diffuse through the extracellular fluid and act on the neighboring type of cell. And this type of communication, it is known as the paracrine communication. Whereas the autocrine communication includes this cell will secrete the chemical messengers which will bind to the receptors which is present on the same cell itself. And that type of communication, it is known as the autocrine communication. And the last one is the juxtacrine communication. That is, some cells will express multiple repeats of growth factors. For example, tumor growth factor alpha. That is, the other cells have these receptors. So the TGF alpha will bind to the TGF alpha receptor which is present on the other cell, thereby helps in producing local foci of growth. And that type of communication between the cells, it is known as the juxtacrine communication. And the main chemical messengers which is involved in the intercellular communication can be either neurotransmitters or hormones. And the example for the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, and the example for hormones are basically thyroid hormones, steroid hormones, etc. And once the ligand, that is either the neurotransmitter or the hormones, bind to these receptors, it will trigger the release of certain intracellular mediators within the cell. And the examples for these intracellular mediators include cyclic AMP, inositol triphosphate as well as diacylglycerol. And so the ligands which first bind to the receptors which is present on the cell, which is known as the extracellular ligands, and they are the first messengers in this intercellular communication. Whereas binding of these ligands onto the receptor will trigger the release of certain intracellular mediators, and these intracellular mediators forms the second messengers in the intercellular communication. Next is about the properties of the receptors. There are certain properties for the receptors which is present on the cell. That is, in some cases, these excess chemical messengers can cause down regulation of receptors. That is, whenever the chemical messengers is secreted in excess of quantity, there will be a decrease in the number of the active receptors, thereby modulating the action. And this type of regulation by the receptors, it is known as the down regulation. Whereas in case of deficiency of those chemical messengers, there will be an increase in the number of the active receptors which is present on the cell. And that type of regulation in case of deficiency of the chemical messengers is known as the upregulation of the receptors. So this down regulation as well as upregulation are the two properties of the receptors which is present on the cell during the intercellular communication. So once the membrane receptors, when it is bind by the extracellular ligand, that is the first messenger, it will initiate the release of second messengers or other intracellular events within the cell. And this is with the help of a GTP binding protein, basically the G proteins. And this second messengers will activate the protein kinases, which are the enzymes present in the cell. And examples for these protein kinases in our body include myosin light chain kinase, which is present in the muscle, as well as the phosphoryl kinase. And this will catalyze the phosphorylation of either tyrosine or serine proteins as well as the threonine residues in the proteins. Next is about the principal mechanisms of action of the chemical messengers in the extracellular fluid. These chemical messengers in the extracellular fluid made their action in the cells either by causing opening or closing of the ion channels in the cell membrane. And the classical example by which the chemical messenger which open or close ion channels in the cell membrane and makes the physiological effects is in case of the acetylcholine, which the action is on the nicotinic cholinergic receptor. And the second mechanism by which the chemical messengers can act is they can act via either cytoplasmic or nuclear receptor, thereby increasing the transcription of the selected mRNAs. And this type of mechanism of action is seen in case of thyroid hormone as well as steroid hormones. Third mechanism of action of the chemical messengers is by the activation of phospholipase C. And the activation of the phospholipase C will produce an intracellular production of diacylglycerol or inositol triphosphate as well as other inositol phosphatase. And the angiotensin 2 mainly acts via this mechanism, that is activation of phospholipase C. Next mechanism of action of the chemical messengers is by either activating or inhibiting the adenyl cyclase enzyme. So there will be either an increase or decrease in the intracellular production of the cyclic AMP. And the classical example for this type of mechanism of action is in case of the norepinephrine, which act via the beta 1 receptor, which causes an increase in the cyclic AMP inside the cell. The next mechanism of action of chemical messengers is by increasing the cyclic GMP in the cell, mainly the hormone atrial natriuretic peptide as well as the nitric oxide, which is also known as endothelium derived relaxing factor, which is responsible for the vasodilatation of the blood vessels. Both these act by increasing the cyclic GMP in the cell. Next mechanism of action of the chemical messengers is via increasing the tyrosine kinase activity of the cytoplasmic portion of the transmembrane receptors. And the classical example for this type of mechanism of action is in case of the hormone insulin as well as the EGF, that is endothelium derived growth factor. And next is the mechanism of action by increasing the serine as well as or threonine kinase activity. And the classical example is tumor growth factor beta. Thank you. That is about the intracellular communications. Please don't confuse between intercellular communications as well as intercellular connections.